John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Great to have you here. We've known each other for quite some time.
We have.
But we've never really spoken in this context, in this setting, so appreciate you coming along. It's a different environment, so try and relax.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll do fine. I know who you are. The listeners don't know who you are, so perhaps you give us a little run through in terms of what you do, you know, how you're doing it, what you do now in your current role, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what is the Building Safety Act and the regulator.
Yeah. I suppose I'll start by saying I'm a registered building inspector. I've been in building control for longer than I care to imagine, so it's 20-odd plus years.
Impossible for a 21-year-old.
And, kind of got into the industry by accident, but it's a role I really like. It's every day is different. You know, being in the construction industry that, you know, no hour's the same in your working week, never mind any day. So, currently head a small team in our Leeds office, building standards team, looking at various different types of commercial building regs applications and advising clients on their Gateway 2 applications and how to approach the Building Safety Act.
Excellent. It's something that interests me about, obviously we use LinkedIn a lot and things, and you've got I don't know whether it's a slogan or whether it's a mission statement or whatever it is, but transforming communities together, I think is...
transforming society.
Societies together, sorry, my mistake. Which I think is really interesting. One of the things that we'll perhaps pick up on later is the impact of what we do actually builds the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And that can often be mistaken or sort of disregarded by the professionals within our industry. But actually, when you sit back and look at it from a non-professional perspective, a lot of the decisions that we make form the way we get to work, the building that we sit in at work, etc., so on and so forth, the place where we eat our dinner. So I was just wanted to pick up on that, and I think it's a great way to look at it, and I like the ethos behind that. Is there any particular reason that that's your outlook, or is I know that's, well, you tell me.
Yeah, well, SWECO is a multidisciplinary organisation. You know, we employ 22,000 people across Europe, and we deal everything from architectural design through to infrastructure projects and compliance and risk as well. So, as you say, buildings are, the part of our everyday lives, whether we like it or not. And from catching a bus in the morning from a bus station, or going to your office or working from home, those buildings will have had some regulatory oversight. There are regulations that cover the Amazon warehouses that you get your parcels from, the airport terminals.
We get a few of them in our house.
It's everywhere. And if you're not outside, you're in a building, and that building will have had some form of compliance assessment. So
100%.
That forms our society, and the work that SWECO do in the UK, we do a lot of infrastructure stuff. So the town centre regeneration work, our teams work on those. We've got one that's just been more or less finished in Bradford City Centre for their City of Culture year. Okay. Pedestrianisation and kind of giving back the city centre to the people, rather than it being predominantly a transport route. It's for the people, it's for society, it's for everyone to use and come together. So.
And that's hugely important, right? Because you look at the way that the city is. We're in Manchester today.
Yeah.
I know that you've worked out of Manchester or within Manchester for a long time. So have I. And it's a completely different city today than what it was. Not even taking into consideration the residential side of it. Just the way that you move around the city has changed.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to get that right. It fundamentally changes the way that people operate in their daily lives.
Absolutely. I remember I first, made real strides into Manchester in a previous role back in sort of 2011. And the city was vastly different in a way that you could navigate around it. There were less bus gates for a start, and less chance of getting a parking ticket, and more places to park.
Agree with that one. Yeah.
But the city has changed. The way Manchester has evolved, it's brought people back into the city.
Yeah.
And the council and the development partners, some of which we work together. They've made real strides to create communities in the city centre and make Manchester, a destination city.
The best town in the world.
And it's brilliant. It's got a real vibe to it that you don't get many other places.
100%. Going to agree with you. I've got a strong affection for Manchester, and I think it's a lot of people's favourite place, and for all good reason. Maybe some competition coming from Bradford based on what you've just said. But
yeah, I think they've got a long way to go, but I think the foundations are there, and I think springboard from this city of culture here in Bradford, and it can go on real leaps and bounds.
Well, it didn't do Liverpool any harm, did it?
It didn't.
I think 2008 was that Liverpool.
Yeah, and Hull in 2017, and Coventry in between.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's got the history tells us that it's good for
absolutely. So within that is a huge demand for residential property. If you look at Manchester as a whole point again, we've got huge towers going up, which we now refer to affectionately as HRBs within our roles, and with that, following the changes of the BSA, which we've been into now for over 12 months, there's been some significant movement within the way we do things and the way we assess things. So within your role, what do you think's worked? What do you think hasn't worked?
I think, I just want, if I start by underlining the significance of this change, it's the most fundamental change in my generation within the building regs. I think I look at the changes that came in sort of 84 with the introduction of approved inspectors and approved documents, and that was a significant change. But this is a real, root and branch change.
Yeah.
I probably, if I start with things that maybe didn't go so well, I think the implementation of the new legislation hasn't been done very well.
The rollout, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it's been, in some respects, quite rushed.
Yeah.
We were still getting legislation approved in the August ahead of the October 23 introduction.
Yeah.
And that doesn't give industry much time, especially when you're dealing with kind of HRB type projects, because you are 18 months, 12 months ahead of where, legislation change might take place. And you've got to kind of unpick a project to meet these changes. It is quite a difficult process.
I think that was a big part of it, actually, John. I think, from a commercial perspective, a lot of the developers were already, as you say, 18 months, 2 years into a project in terms of concept and design, etc. And then all of a sudden there was a lot of noise around the fact, well, what changes, how does it change, how quickly have we got to change it, and what are the implications of not changing it. And I think that's something that I saw a lot of in terms of the relationships that I've got with my client base and developers, etc. But I think that was a sort of an overarching concern. And I agree with what you say, the information coming in just a little bit too close to the line, or that's how it felt anyway. So yeah, I can't disagree with you on any of that.
Yeah. I think what has gone well, I feel that the value of compliance has been put in the spotlight, and the value of having, a trusted building control provider has it's changed the landscape, and we've seen consolidations within the building control market within businesses that are made investments and bought other providers and tried to strengthen their position in the market. I think in some respects that's been really good, and I think Sweco's been on that journey with some of the businesses that they've acquired, not just in the building control sector but across Europe, to improve that offering to clients and to help help people solve their development problems. But I think building control is a little bit unique here in the UK because we can't kind of have two hands in the same we can't be offering design advice and offering as a entity and then offering compliance services, because you've got that conflict of interest. But the building control business stands in partnership, but aside from the Sweco consultancy business that operates in the UK. So it complements it, but it's a standalone.
And I was just about to say, actually, it done correctly, it is complementary. Not done correctly, it could undermine the entire process, and I think that's important. And it's interesting. Just go back a little bit in terms of the acquisitions and things, commercial acquisitions that got done. I think they've turned out really well, from what I can gather so far, at least across the sort of the macro economy in which I operate, as opposed to European global networking. But there was a concern, I suppose, from some of the smaller companies that there was going to be a monopoly situation, and there's bound to have been some casualty there from highly competent but smaller companies that didn't get acquired as part of a commercial process. So for me, I think that is part of one of the downfalls of what's been done. However, as we get further into this, I think that was necessary, because at the same time, without being specific about anything or anyone in particular, there were certain organisations that that didn't sort of come through that process, and I think you're right. It's raised the bar by setting a new standard, in terms of operational level and at regulation level.
Yeah, I think I do see that it set the bar higher, and I think as we become audited by the new regulator, which SWECO have gone through, and they were very, very positive in our processes and procedures and the way we manage our projects and our teams of work together. But I think there's still a definite role for SMEs within the building control sector. I think as business models change and some of the larger, they change their ideal client market, don't they? And I think the SMEs can be as agile in that marketplace and offer, just as good a service, within that place.
Absolutely, and you're right. So the market changes slightly, but there's opportunities that open up that maybe otherwise weren't there, and it sort of it puts people in lanes, so to speak, in terms of capability, which obviously we've got the grading now on the registered building inspectors and things. And that all leads into this demonstration of competency. In a previous recording I did with Andrew Bannister, we talked about that. We talked about the ability to demonstrate, maintain and develop competency, but effectively, as opposed to, sort of running under a single banner that covers a broad scope of professionals, if you will. It's now far more specific, and I think that has to be a good thing. Yeah,
it's worked really well in the building control sector. I think the only downside is we've lost staff that didn't feel like that assessment process was, either suited their skill sets in terms of, we've got people that have been in the industry 40 years and they're not Microsoft Office.
Of course.
People that can use the software effectively for producing a portfolio of work, but they know the job and they know the role. And unfortunately, they've kind of opted to take retirement over that role or move into other parts of the industry, such as warranty providers or clerical works.
I was going to say your loss is maybe someone else. Someone else's gain.
I think the challenge now is for the rest of the industry to catch up. Building control has kind of been the test bed on that competency framework.
Yeah.
And I've had discussions with architects about, how they, and I know that the RIBA and the ARB are working on how they can support their members to develop and demonstrate competence and create a pathway so people can grow. Because the last thing you want in a market where competence you don't want it to be competence at kind of all costs. It's got to be a balanced approach of, yes, the person undertaking the project has got to be competent, but the system has to be flexible enough to allow someone to develop into a role. So And in the building control sector, a lot of the people who are registered 3G and H and are at the level 4 as a management role, they're in their senior parts of their career. They've got 10, 15 years left in the industry.
Yeah.
And it's about bringing new people through to be able to pick up that and shadow and develop into those roles, because otherwise the resourcing issue that kind of current building control currently faces, which we'll probably go on to talk about delays in applications for HRBs, but that'll just get bigger. That gap will get bigger.
100%. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's important for people to be able to gain the exposure they need to develop their skill set further. Otherwise, it becomes a very stagnant system, and that's no good for anyone. No. I think I also agree with you in terms of the wider industry. Certainly from an internal perspective with our client base, we now demonstrate, whilst we don't have to, but in the warranty market, for example, we demonstrate the experience level of our staff, and we mirror that in line with the building control levels. So we take into consideration the guidelines and frameworks presented to the building control industry, and we sort of we've analysed our staff, our surveyors, within those parameters and given an indication of what they are capable of. And then we operate within those parameters as well. And I think we're trying to preempt that in the industry. It's likely to become more of an official thing in time. And to be honest, I welcome that. I think it's good. It allows you, even on a commercial basis, it allows you to set out sort of benchmarks within people's career path and say, look, this is where you're at now. This is what you've got to do to get to the next stage. When you do that, and we can help you do that, but when you achieve that and we can demonstrate it, then that will open up a whole new scope of works for you to deal with. And that's quite an exciting prospect.
Yeah. I think, competency is kind of the genie is out of the bottle. It's there to stay, and it's going to affect. We were already talking. Government are already talking about having licensed contractors.
Yeah,
and that's going to trickle down to the subcontractor supply chain. And why wouldn't it? If there's an expectation that the people in charge of delivering a project have to demonstrate competence and be licensed and registered, then the supply chain's going to have to follow through, and that could come down to your 4 or 5 decorating strong business. Absolutely. That they need to demonstrate that they, it's all about placing things in context, though. So yes, they're good at decorating. They could decorate this room. They could decorate a house. But what's it like to work on an 18-story building and understanding, some of the things that you're working around in doing your job are critical life safety systems, and how could those affect what you do? Yeah. So it's having that broader understanding and recognition of.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating an example, you go down the Doc M route, and then you're looking at the contrasting colours to doors internally, etc. But also, I think it leans heavily into the what is sort of the new part, if you will. Used to be covered by CDM. It all sort of gets bunched together now, which is the health and safety aspect of it. The working practices within that environment, the way that you work, to carry out your role within that process also needs to be demonstrated at the onset. And the thing is, whilst no one likes to be tested, and I think, just going back to what you said earlier, some of our more senior colleagues that have been doing this for a long time potentially felt a little bit ousted by the process, and understandably so. That's because the way that this needs to be demonstrated didn't suit their sort of skill set. But as you said, and it's important that everyone understands, they were still more than competent to do the job. So I think there does need to be a little bit of adjustment there within the industry to allow people to demonstrate their skills in a way that proves competency, but doesn't isolate someone from the career that they've been.
We talked about it earlier on today about, we're in a neurodivergent world, and people approach things in a different way. And it's about meeting, being able to support someone to flourish in their role. And, certain assessment methodologies might not suit those individuals, but it doesn't mean that they can't do the job.
100%.
So we have the industry has that to meet that challenge of being as inclusive as they can in demonstrating compliance, because if the benchmark is you sit an exam to demonstrate compliance, some people won't do it, but it doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing the job. And we need to be able to bring people in, and the increase in people with things like ADHD and autism in the school system, that they've got to go into employment, and the construction industry is a great place to work. And I know this isn't directly related to regulations,
but it's really interesting because there's so much talent that within that demographic, if you will. And I mean, for example, you talk about exams. I've sat many exams over the years, and I'm terrible at them. And it was only when I did a degree course when I was in my early 30s, or I can't remember, late 20s, early 30s, that I found out that I'm fairly, I'm dyslexic, and so much so I can't think of the word I was trying to put before that. But I am dyslexic, and that was picked up by the lecturers at the university, and they said, "Look, you're dropping points for fun here. By the way, your content is great, your context is good, the message you're trying to get across, but the way that we mark this work means that you're just hemorrhaging points because of what we believe to be dyslexia." And I took a test, and it was revealing, to say the least. But I'm good at. I like to think, at least, I'm good at my job. I try my best to be good at my job, and it doesn't. Now I understand it. It actually helps a little bit, but it doesn't change a lot, actually. No. So you're right. We've got to embrace these new I say new challenges. They've always existed, but I think we recognise them more than ever, and that needs to come into the commercial world, if you will.
Yeah.
So I couldn't agree with you more on that either. We're doing a lot of agreeing today, which is good.
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on something. I don't know whether your experience is the same. Obviously, this new process was all-encompassing. It covers every aspect of construction, but specifically in HRBs, there seems to be a significant bottleneck in the industry in terms of projects getting through Gateway 2 into the construction phase. And then similarly, Gateway 3, less so perhaps. Is that something you've experienced in your role, or have you got a different view to me?
No, it's something that I've experienced. And part of me feels a bit conflicted with it, because...
Good. Content.
As a regulator, you expect the person putting something in front of you to have met their obligations. Under the Building Safety Act, the principal designer, they're responsible for, making sure that the scheme they put forward is compliant. Yeah. And if they're not competent to do that themselves, that they've engaged a third party, much like SWECO, would support them in that process to say, there's some deficiencies in your design, you need to develop that further because the regulator will need this information.
Yeah.
But I think there's been a gap between, and I'd use it a bit like when you're trying to explain something to a child, is you've got to really describe what you want, and you've got to break it down, and not just say you need to submit a compliance scheme for us to assess. So there should, it feels like again that the regulators almost missed a trick in being a little bit more, offering a bit more guidance. So that not telling people exactly what they need to do, but saying,
these are the bullet points.
These are the bullet points. Yeah. They have produced some information, but I think people still feel like it's a little bit of a finger in the air as to how deep they, are they going to be designing it to, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the next 3 months.
Yeah, and to what level of detail do you need?
Do they need a section through a screw head? Is that, for a fire door hinge or something?
Yeah.
But it's being able to, from a regulator point of view, to say, these are the parameters I want you to work within. Giving some kind of, rules, not rules to the game, but this is our terms of engagement, and you need to fulfill these functions. And it's about giving it the best chance of getting through as quickly. But then we're also faced with, as kind of already mentioned, there's a resourcing issue within the industry. So things take longer because there's not enough people to do it. And I think the regulators probably underestimated the volume of work that comes through, especially when we're dealing with, minor alterations within a HRB. We both worked on HRBs, and, if you've got someone's altering a storeroom to a co-working space, or, changing the use of part of the building, it can be beset with the work to do the actual construction work can be done in 4 or 5 weeks, but the regulatory process of approving and signing off
is 12 plus.
Could be 12, 20 weeks.
Yeah.
I've heard of projects that are in Gateway 2 that have been in nearly 30 weeks. And the regulator it's building that multidisciplinary team and making sure there's enough people within the regulator to fulfill that function, or their third parties that they're engaging with and their partners in delivering that service can do it.
So just to push into your confliction a little bit more then, do you think that that's an oversight? Commercially speaking, I think that there'll be a lot of people out there that say, you've asked us to do all this, we're doing it to the best we can, but one, we're taking a bit of a stab at the dark in it. And because they've not met people like you, they've not got that guidance yet. They're coming from an isolated developer position, if you want, as an example. And we've done everything we think we need to do, and we've given it to you in a timely manner. And 30 weeks later, I'm still explaining to my lenders why I can't do anything. My planning permission's on the brink of lapsing. All these things. These are all the moans and groans that are coming out of the industry. And I'm not asking you for a definitive answer, but just an opinion is, is that an oversight by the regulator? Is that something? Was it not anticipated to be this big?
I think it's an underestimation, and I think, at the time, there was people speak and say, we can deliver this on behalf of the regulator. I think. The largest public sector body that represents building control bodies, we're all in favor, saying, if this changes tomorrow, we can service it. But I think then when you come down the competency route and the demographic of the age of the surveyors, the complexity of the process, all this erodes. So on paper, everyone should be able to, it's just turn the page next, we carry on. But I think the reality is that there's lots of things that have eroded since the kind of its concept when it came out in sort of 2022 of this is what we're going to do, as to where we are now. And I think, the world's changed post-COVID. And it's another influencing factor. And again, it changes the way people work. Some people don't want to work full-time. Some people don't want to work in an office. All these things affect every part of every industry. You'll know people that you used to see in an office every day, but you only see them once a week or twice a week now because the working environment is much more flexible. But I think when you're dealing with these multidisciplinary teams and you're pulling people in from private sector, whether it be structural engineer checkers or fire engineers, and you're bringing all these people together, they've got other commercial pressures as well. They don't just work for the regulator. It's not
absolutely.
They don't have a monopoly over their time. So, and as a business, they've got to kind of, we can give the regulator 2 days a week, but we've got other fee earning work we need to deliver that in that time as well. So, it's a complex landscape. And the other conflicted part of me is, a designer should be designing a compliance scheme because they're a designer. The guidance documents are all there from a regulatory point of view. And the real shift sort of post introduction of the Building Safety Act is, I hate the words. When you're checking a scheme, and there's lots of things, clauses, foundations, drainage, insulation, detailing, waterproofing, to the acceptance or to the satisfaction of the building control officer or building control surveyor.
A bit of a liability shift, perhaps.
But it's not building control's role, and it's never been building control's role to undertake that function. And I think designers need to look more holistically, and there's an emphasis in the guidance that's come out from the regulator, and things that we talk to clients with is kind of plan, manage, and monitor. So if you're planning a scheme, if you're planning a scheme and managing that scheme, to manage it, you've got to like first principle, as if, you know, we'll talk about a simple extension to a house. We don't have to talk about HRB because, as you said, the changes cover everything.
Yeah.
If you're an architect and you've not lifted your head over the fence each side to see if there's a manhole in either garden, you're not doing your job. You know, that it's basic.
How often do we see that, though?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest.
And you can guarantee as a building inspector when you go out, it's permitted development under planning, so it's a fixed maximum size, and you can guarantee that the new extended wall, where they're going to have nice bifolds into the garden, are right above the shared drain, the sewer.
Because that's why they're there in the first place. You know, I think
as a designer, you should be planning, and you should be foundation depth. There should be some trial holes done. There should be a structural engineer involved, ground investigation, even on a domestic project. Because if there isn't, how can you demonstrate something is compliant? And I've used this principle in the past in my role dealing with off-site construction and modular. You know, you see a lot of applications that come in and it's for a, you know, modular built building. Yeah. And you inspect the foundations and the building arrives.
That interface detail.
But who's checked whether the building that arrives is compliant? Who's gone around the factory and done an audit? You know, I've done it before.
So have I.
You've done it before.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that type of process and how you engage. You know, it's not just about how can I say something complies with Part A if I've never seen the structure?
Yeah, and even then, is that even if it's compliant in the factory, for argument's sake, is it still compliant when it arrives? Yeah. Does the interface work? Does the line loads or the point loads of the foundation system meet the requirements of the superstructure?
Yeah.
There's all these different things. I just want to go back a little bit, just because it's important that people understand what we mean. So when we talk about the comment, and I can't remember the exact wording you used, but to the satisfaction of, it's for me that is massively taken out of context. So the satisfaction of well, you might tell me differently actually, but my assumption is that it's compliant material installed properly, but that doesn't necessarily mean it works, because you've got the whole workmanship side of things. You've got the whole interface with everything else. You could have 5 components that are all compliant, but don't work. Yeah. They can be positioned incorrectly. They can be in the wrong setting. They can be all these things, and historically, that is something that sort of I've dealt with in my role as a clerk of works.
Yeah.
And even to the point, to some extent, on the warranty side of things, because we look at things differently. We're not looking at things. We are looking at compliance, but we're also looking at risk.
Yeah.
And that risk comes in various formats. So one thing I'm seeing now is that as the clerk of works, let's stick with that for a minute, there's a lot more involvement, we are being requested to be a lot more involved a lot earlier on in the process, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, I don't think it takes away from the requirement of the designer to understand it. You know, if you are designing it, yes, consult with clerk of works, consult with warranty companies, consult with regulation consultants and building control officers, etc. But the fundamental understanding of that system, let's call it, working, being compliant, practically proficient, still has to be at the design stage.
Yes, absolutely, and that's where these compliance declarations and things come through in the regulations. And you're right, an architect is charged with taking a client's vision and transforming that into a reality, and that's no different whether it's someone's, forever home, or it's a 40-story residential tower. Each building will provide a function for the funder or the lender, the person who owns that building, who's decided that I'm going to build this 40-story tower, I'm going to sell homes, and it's going to be a community. And we both work with developers and continue to work with developers who endeavour to create a community, not just
neighbourhoods.
And neighbourhoods. And I think designers need to remember that it's not just about submitting a drawing and compliance is dealt with. It's a hurdle that has to be overcome by a regulatory body. It's about being able to say, I've designed this, I think it's compliant, and these are the reasons why, and here's the evidence.
That's the bit, isn't it? These are the reasons why, and it's interesting. So one thing that I'm learning more about now is, and we touched on it maybe 10 minutes ago, is what are these reasons? And I think this will help the industry, and I know this is what you do, so I'm not going to ask you to give your business model away in a podcast, but, fundamentally, as time goes on, as more submissions are rejected or accepted based on certain parameters, presuming that there's a consistency there, which I think that there ought to be, the hope is that the process becomes more fluid.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything, without giving your entire business plan away, are any fundamentals that people should consider when making their first applications? Let's stick with domestic. So, what do people now need to think about differently that perhaps they didn't have to think about before?
I think it's about defining responsibilities. I think I don't currently really work in the domestic sector, but sometimes I give advice to people within my network that do. And I think my advice to anyone doing the domestic work would be to utilise a formal contract that defines some liabilities and roles. And I know that the RIBA produce them, and obviously the JCT produce contracts.
Federation of Master Builders. There's quite a few out there.
And so, the varying levels of some of them are stronger than others, but it's better to have something on the table than not. If you have to go into arbitration over an issue, then you need a basis to work from, and a quote and an invoice doesn't really cut that. It's about building that foundation, and then understanding who's responsible for what parts. And I think it's really difficult for domestic customers to understand that, because they'll employ an architect or a surveyor or a technician to produce design, and they're all quite competent at being able to do that. But then it's kind of who's responsible for the gaps, because you will get in a situation where
you always do.
It's a conditional approval, or something's not quite, until you strip a house back, and we've both worked on enough houses to know, until you start stripping them back, you never assume anything, because something will always bite you.
There's been plenty of surprises over the years, haven't
there? And I think, so it's understanding that in context with the Building Safety Act. So if an architect designs an extension or a new house, and they've, assumed foundations into clay soil, it's, 800 mil deep or whatever, and there's no trees nearby. It's amazing how many people don't check for trees.
Yeah, well, the heap, VCP, and there's just things.
But then the contractor, if they're charged with delivering that and finalising those details, they might use a sub-consultant to do some foundations, or a subcontractor.
Yeah. But
they take on some design risk, because they've got to take that kind of principle from the architect and transfer it into reality. And you'll have to get, on developments now, you'll have a structural engineer that design the foundations, they'll design the steelwork, but they should always be done on the basis of a study into the viability of that foundation design.
Yeah.
I've worked on numerous schemes where you expect strip footings and that they dig a hole and they keep digging and they keep digging and it's filled, and they ended up needing a raft. Now, under the Building Safety Act, that is it's a change that someone needs to take responsibility for. The principal designer should be, it's that plan, manager, monitor all the way through. Yeah. And gone are the days where an architect will draw planning drawings and or some basic, stage 4 drawings, 3+.
Yeah.
With some notes for compliance, but no detail. And you can't submit that to building control now because it's just not.
It doesn't mean a great deal, does it?
It doesn't, and it doesn't tell the registered building inspector whether it's compliant or not. The designer, if they're submitting it, you're more or less making a declaration that this is a compliant design in submitting it.
Yeah,
because you want an approval. So there's an implied kind of response, and there's a responsibility there. And I think it's about that, defining those and understanding if things change, what do we need to do? And it's not a case of the building inspector will oversee that change, sign it off, and it doesn't really get recorded. Drawings need to be updated, and there needs to be much more professionalism in the
coordination of it.
Coordination.
Yeah, I think,
and that it's more of the number of architects who used to be involved with projects. Even if they did stage 4, or stage 5 based drawings, submitted for approval, gets approved. There's your approval, Mr. Domestic Customer.
Yeah.
And then you're never seen again.
Off he pops. Yeah.
But now, as a designer, you're the principal designer. You've got to work with the principal contractor, and you've got to have that communication. And again, that goes back down to that plan, manager, monitor.
It does. Yeah.
So
we talk about competency, coordination, and accountability, really.
Yeah.
But that's defined by the regulation in terms of the duty holder. So someone has to adopt that, and that could be the homeowner, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's something for them to consider. So, if people are in doubt, they need to speak to people who know what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting.
I think it's a really different. It's a positive change for the industry because it makes people think about the role that they undertake. And the implications of getting it wrong, and the accountability all the way through the system. So
the implications are fairly strong as well, aren't they? At high level, should the worst happen,
you're spending time at His Majesty's pleasure.
Which is not on the agenda.
No, so it's people need to kind of go back to that. Think about the society you're creating by the bit of work that you do.
Yeah. And I agree entirely. I think this is a change that the industry needed. It's just a transitional bit that makes it interesting.
I think it's quite clunky at the minute. Yeah. I think if you said to me, is this the system you'd envisage if you had a blank piece of paper? Absolutely not. I think some of the things that have been done. I've kind of had conversations with people in the industry and people who understand the legalities of regulations probably and the way that legislation and government work, and that all this is still underpinned by a piece of legislation that was written 40 some years ago.
Sure.
Building Act 1984 is still underpins a lot of this. And if I was taking the Hackett review and thinking of a building control system fit for the future, I wouldn't start with the Building Act 1984
because it's the age that it's at. It's 40 years old this year.
I would, there was a review taken of building control pathways all across the world as part of the Hackett review, and I think with Mr. Trick,
what's the trick?
I think it should have been back to first principle. I think when you look at all the different pieces of legislation that's had to change and be amended to accommodate these, much needed changes. But I think the best way of dealing with it would have been to kind of start with a blank piece of paper.
Yeah.
Start with, the values of what you want to achieve, the behaviours you want to embed within the construction sector, and then produce a set of rules and regulations that empower those, because
hamstrung, isn't it? The new system's hamstrung by the regulation. And I mean, there's still potentially scope for that. I don't think anyone in our industry is gone, right, that's it now. We're always striving for more. So maybe that is a transitional process, because we've already talked about the impact in terms of timeframes, etc., with the BSA and the BSR. I would argue that it would have been significantly more if we had to start from scratch. But it'd be interesting to see what the process will be moving forwards and where we will be in, say, 10 years' time.
Yeah,
I'm optimistic. I'm looking forward to it. But I think it won't be without some significant challenges.
No, and there's kind of conflicting approaches from, we've got these delays in gaining approval for developments, but major developments that are going to, it's place changing, it's change transforming society, it's transforming, taking cities into the future, and then but we're also kind of, the regulations are kind of the parachute out the backs, slowing that process down, so that the will and the intent is in the right. I think it's coming from the right place, but I think there needs to be a quite a quick review of how things are going. And I know the government have said this October they've got a independent panel to review kind of builder control and the builder control process. And I'm optimistic that will. The government are doing, the regulator are doing audits of builder control bodies against our new operational standards and rules, which are the framework in which we have to operate.
That's all really important data.
Yeah, and it's data that should steer how the service is delivered in the future. And we have that model in the UK of private sector builder control and public sector builder control. Yep. And I think the regulator kind of almost takes that away to some extent, because the regulator is in charge of building control.
The buck stops here. So
whether it's a local authority or private sector, they are a service operator, within that framework. And you look at how we deliver other regulatory functions and public service functions in the country, and there's no reason why it can't be this public-private network.
Look, it has to be, doesn't it? Let's be honest, it has to be. If it's not, then it's just too small a thing. I think there's a lot of people that are going to welcome any change to speed up the process, but it needs to be done in a way that it doesn't undermine the process.
It doesn't dilute the intent that we've got about delivering safer buildings. And I think having a regulator that can provide much more a positive footing for how we move forward. And I think that's probably where it does feel sometimes that they're very negative in their approach. Those that say, we've had all these applications in and loads of them have been rejected because they're insufficient in but I think when you've not kind of given the people the rules of the game, that's going to happen. And
it almost feels like a trap, do you think? It's almost a bit like, well, come on, give me a clue. Because, I think, but it's a catch-22.
It is for the regulator. They've got to be firm, but I think there needs to be a different approach. And I think that it's already starting. I was with a client in an MDT, which is their multidisciplinary team with the regulator and all their sub-consultants a few weeks ago. And it was a much more collaborative process than I thought, I felt that had happened probably
Okay.
even 6 months ago. I think
Yeah.
the regulator has softened to the fact that they've got to provide a bit more of a supportive framework for people to do the right thing. And I think rather than we can't kind of go into a world where you're told this isn't good enough, go away and come back again, because that doesn't teach anybody. That just it doesn't create the right behaviours. I think
it makes people nervous, and I think it's commercially non-viable.
Yeah.
If the success of your project or your finance or your planning is purely down to a decision that may be accidental, it may be misperceived, it may be whatever, and someone says, "Well, no, that's it. Go to the back of the queue."
Yeah.
That could and does and probably will continue to have a massive effect until there comes a mechanism where someone can say, right, you're 98% there. However, we need some more assurances around A, B, and C.
Yeah.
If you can give us that in the next 2 weeks, then that's where we're at, and it's that level of communication. However, just to sort of change my stance on this a little bit, it's also the first time for the regulator. This is an entirely new process, and the only thing that is set in stone is they have to change the industry.
Yeah.
So a robust approach was required.
Yeah.
You've got to sort of make a big splash, and then create some finite detail around it. It doesn't take away any of the frustrations of the developers and the financiers and the insurers and things. However, the old saying is you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, and I think that's probably what we're seeing now.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. The regulator is in a position where they've kind of inherited something that, it's like a business turnaround, isn't it? You're coming in and you've got the foundations of something that can work, but it's going to be some pain in getting there. And I think, I do sympathise with the regulator. I'm not just for the developer. As I said earlier on, it's got to the people making the applications have got to be confident that their scheme is compliant, and there's not really any excuse not to do that.
That should have always been the case.
But I think people relied on and leaned on the building control sector, and I've seen it in my 20 years that they kind of like. The building inspector's plan assessment will fill the gaps for them, tell them what they need to provide, and there's always instances where, we can't do that. What can we do? And it's like, well, that's gone now. It's down to them to kind of make sure that they've assessed the risk and come up with a robust scheme.
Which is a much better concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is, because as we've said probably 2 or 3 times in this session already, it places the accountability where it needs to be.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, for example, even at the point of a traditional plan check, if you will, by your AI, that's still a reactive.
Which is the building control approver now.
Which is so that's gone. Strike that out. But even at that point, it's reactive because you're so far down the line in the process in terms of procurement and planning permission, etc. You're making reactive decisions where doing it this way.
Yeah,
it should be the case that actually before too much is expended, you know what you're doing.
And I think, my experience on the whole, especially when dealing with large projects, is that there is that early engagement, in the advisory role where we're advising on the compliance of the scheme as it's been developed. We're coming in at REBA stage 2, if not earlier, concept, and making sure that, that the foundations of the scheme are going to be in. And I don't talk about foundations in the holes in the ground. I'm talking about
the fundamental,
the first line of paper, and as you then develop that design, I've kind of got, the compliance is the bit in the middle of the rock, stick of rock. It's embedded into it, and that transfers into that golden thread, and then that transfers into, the building in use. And I was speaking at an event in London a couple of weeks ago, and people think about. I think there's some misconceptions in the industry that this golden thread is kind of like the O&M manual. It's a digital O&M, but you think of it as if you build a building tomorrow, you build a 20-story office building in Manchester, and your golden thread captures everything through that construction process, right into occupation. And in 40 years' time, that scheme has felt like, this building's come to its end of its useful life now.
Yeah.
It's fulfilled its function. The world's moved on. We're going to replace it. The golden thread now is more than just compliance. They can say, well, we know how much foundations we need to scrub out because there's a record of the foundations.
Yeah.
We know what materials are in the building that can be recycled, that can be repurposed. Yeah. We know how many tons of steel there is in this building, and reinforcement and concrete.
Yeah.
And all this, effectively, you're stripping it back. And I liken it to the things that the motor industry has gone through. That they've all got to declare how many % of their car is recyclable.
Yeah.
And what can be reused, and what goes into landfill. And the emphasis is you don't put stuff into landfill. But this golden thread is more than just a record of compliance. It allows you to. It's like doing your Lego manual in reverse. It's about, you can take it apart and everything. Everything is, and what you've got as a sum of.
Exactly, and an analogy that I've used in the past is, imagine if we had the golden thread before we discovered asbestos. Imagine if we had a fundamental understanding that if we could go back and go, well, that's where not only there is asbestos in that building, but this is actually where it is exactly.
Yeah.
I know there were records, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting it was completely blindsided, but there was always, there was an entire industry made out of asbestos removal, asbestos identification, etc. That would have been a lot easier if we'd have just known that was a component of the build. It was in there for all the right reasons initially, but no one really recorded it that well enough that you can understand where it is. Yeah. I use the golden thread concept as well for various other things, and I'll explain what I mean. We do a lot of recladding works as our clerk of works consultancy, and within that we use a system that raises every single thing. So even if it's a missing screw, even if it's a snapshot in time, we mention everything. And initially, we used to take a little bit of heat off the contractors. Well, I'm going to fix that today, so that doesn't need to go in, and I'm going to do that today. And my argument has always been, no, it all goes in, and then it all gets closed. And we date stamp all of our responses now. So if you raise something at 2:00 on a Wednesday, and you receive the photograph at 4:00 on a Wednesday, great, it goes in.
Yeah.
But when you've got to demonstrate to a regulator or a third party, this is where you started, this is where you've ended up, how did you do it?
Yeah.
We can show this now. We can say we attended on this day and we raised points 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
And by the following week or the next day or whatever it is, we close them out. And not only we close them out, but we can say when, how, and at what time and by who.
Yeah. We have a similar system from a regs compliance point of view. So all our site inspections are all plan-based site inspections.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at a facade or we're looking at a floor plan and there's something missing, you can pinpoint where it is on the plan. The photos are geotagged because we have to be geotagged now under the OSRs. And then you write the description of what it is. That report goes to the client. They can then upload the photo into the report to demonstrate that they've done it. Or if it's like a fire stopping independent report, that can get dropped in, and it just closes that open issues.
Fundamentally the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the importance of it in hindsight is what I want to tap into, because someone can open that system, open that binder, and they can go, "Oh, that was the life of the journey. Oh, yeah, consideration was made to that here." And it was resolved here, whether it be design consideration, material consideration, changes of materials. Obviously, we live in a world where you have to buy things and things change. And certainly more recently, there's been disruption in the market in terms of getting materials, etc. But we document everything. And it's almost, this is your life of that project.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's so important.
Yeah. And I think, it sets things up the right way. I was taking part in a LinkedIn discussion yesterday about, building owners that own multi-use buildings, HRBs over shopping centres, commercial spaces, and then, whether it's an independent section, because if your retail unit or your commercial space doesn't interfere with the HRB space, then you can consider it an independent section. There's other criteria, but fundamentally that's the foundation of that approach. But the tenant then needs to demonstrate that they understand the type of building that they're entering, and whether it's an independent section, and there is, I think, some landowners and building owners are struggling to gather all the information that they need to set that foundation of, here's, and wouldn't it be wonderful? I know there's a few entrepreneurs that have got systems in the marketplace at the minute that kind of manage this golden thread and manage a building's, it's like a medical record for that building, and they can produce floor plans, they can produce areas, they can produce records of when work was undertaken, and you build this story of a building. And I think it is about a story. It's about understanding, how a building's evolved, how it's changed, so that can inform the future. Yeah, we've talked earlier on about it's not about necessarily what's gone on in the past. It's about how we move best foot forward into the future, and having that, that principle of being able to pull out information to say, and for a client to say, I'm going to take a tenancy on that building. It's on the ground floor of a HRB, but it's an independent section. There's all the records from the owner to say it's an independent section. We've verified that it's an independent section, and we've submitted an application to a building control provider, an RBCA like Sweco would, and they've determined that based on the evidence we submitted, they can accept the application and submit the notice because it's an independent section.
Maybe we'll make some time back at that end. In terms of,
I think because we've got sort of 12,500, 13,000 HRVs in the country, the only building safety case is this record will appear, and it should appear in the next sort of 12, 18 months for all these buildings.
Yeah.
And I think, my if anyone wanted to take away, if you're a building owner and you've got HRB stock that has different uses within that building, and you don't know whether it's they're independent sections or not, you need to find out, and you need to do it fast. And there are people that, support that process and help, understand, take the scheme, do surveys, and give advice on what it is, and if it isn't, what do you need to do to make it independent sections.
But fundamentally understand your liabilities. Take responsibility for it, get it recorded, and do it in the right way.
We had issues early doors with duty holder declarations where it came to pension funds, that might own buildings.
Oh, I see. So you got like a multi.
And they're saying, well, we've got to spend £500,000 on this office building, updating the reception space and refurbing the lift and putting new fire doors in.
Sure.
And they go, well, the person who's at the pension fund doesn't. They don't want to sign a declaration.
Well, there's no competence there either, is there?
No. But I think ultimately that then comes back to that supply chain. So the surveyor that they've appointed, or the architectural practice they've appointed to deliver these schemes, should be conversing with them to say, the person, you've appointed me, you've got a portfolio of properties, you've got a budget to spend on. So I need to tell you that this is your responsibility. So you signing off on this work and providing a brief for me to design and deliver the work means that you're the client, and your responsibility is to sign that piece of paper as the client. And it, they can represent an organisation. It's not necessarily them as an individual.
Yeah.
But it's going, it's there's no anonymity really anymore, and I think
no, it has to be done, but it's facilitating people to be educated where they need to be to understand what they're doing.
Yeah.
And done correctly, there should be no reason not to do it. I think that's the message. I think people are always wary of change. People are nervous about putting their name on something, whereas otherwise they may not have done it in the past. But actually, with the right support, with the right professionals and the right level of consultation, it should be a relatively painful process.
Painful or pain-free?
Painless, sorry.
Oh,
what did I say? Painful.
Painful.
I might just say that bit again then.
No, I think, all joking apart, I think what you need, the regulation needs to be robust and the systems need to be robust.
Yeah.
But it needs to be, for the consumer, it needs to be really as simple as taking your car for an MOT.
Great analogy. Yeah.
You take it, you get a certificate to say whether you've passed or failed. If it's failed, this is the work you need to do.
Yeah.
And it's done, and that's
you get advisories, don't you? Yeah.
And that's another example of I mentioned it earlier where public sector and private sector work not in partnership but in parallel.
Yeah.
So you'll have local authorities that will have MOT testing stations for their fleet of HGVs or their vehicles, and you'll have the Mr. Smith garage that does it, or JCT 600 or other vehicle car showrooms or wherever do MOTs, and the industry supports itself, but it's under robust. It still comes under the transport.
But the outcomes are the same, and it's done. It follows guidelines and it's properly. That's really good. So, John, thanks very much. It's been great to speak to you about the BSA, the BSR. If you wanted to leave a message at the end of this podcast for people to act upon, to consider, what would that be?
I think I kind of mentioned it already in the podcast, but it's plan, manage, and monitor, and understand that the value in what they're doing in the designing and constructing projects, and that they're not separate processes; they're joined up.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of keep on top of it. If you're an architect, keep involved through the construction process. Understand that if it's compliant all the way through and there's no issues, that's great. But do it for your vision, your concepts. An architect designs something as an architect because there's some architectural merit in what they do.
Yeah.
So make sure that's just, if only just to see that's carried through.
Yeah.
Just
stand behind it.
Yeah, stand behind it, and the contractor should stand behind the work that they do. And I've talked a lot about some issues in the industry and some of the challenges we face, but I'd end by saying that contractors on the whole that I've dealt with that have taken the time to understand their roles and their responsibilities, it's been fantastic to see that collaboration, to that wanting to do the right thing. And I think the construction industry gets a lot of stick for, and the regulator is beating people with a stick to say you're not submitting sufficient applications, that it's substandard, that it's missing information. But the meetings that I'm in as an advisor to on compliance, and the meeting, there is a real there's a real determination to get it right.
Yeah.
And I there's plenty of people who I would applaud for the work that they're doing to try and other building control providers and the wider building control sector for the work that they've done in kind of flag bearing for this competence and process.
No, absolutely. Well, look, embrace the change.
Yeah, embrace it.
The future's bright.
Run with it. We might not like the rules, but we've got to play the game, and I think it's about change comes from within, and the more feedback that the regulator gets, the more that as we mentioned, people work through the system, the more feedback that the regulator is provided with will, as you said, in 10 years' time, this will be different, but it'll be better different.
Yeah, absolutely. Data is key.
Yeah.
We need to figure this out. And to figure it out, we need to see what gets churned out.
Yeah.
So
thanks very much, Rex.
Excellent. No, thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
No,
Brilliant.
great. Thank you.